Hello and welcome back to day 9 of Ecology. This is actually our last day of Ecology. You did it, you made it through. And if you are watching this on Sunday night, surprise, your test is tomorrow. So please start cramming. Your test is going to be on Monday, all right? So everything from Ecology day 1 to day 9 is fair game. And there will also be an additional day 10 review sheet that's posted as well. However, that review sheet is optional, okay? All right, so let's get started. Make sure you've got your notes out and ready to go as we go through this. There aren't any slides for today, so everything you need to know is going to be on this worksheet we're going through. As always, the first thing you need to do is your do now. Okay, so today our do now is to identify and define the 3 types of symbiosis and give an example of each. So think back to your day 8 video that you should have watched recently. We went over something called symbiosis. And I'll give you a hint. Symbiosis is something, it's talking about relationships between organisms. And I gave you 3 specific examples of symbiosis. So go ahead and pause this video and write down those 3 types of symbiosis as well as an example. And I'll be here waiting whenever you're done. All right, so the very first type of symbiosis is something called mutualism. All right, and in mutualism, you might notice the word mutual in the front, which when we say something is mutual, we mean it's something between us, like for both of us. Like a mutual interest means it's in both of our best interest, okay? So in mutualism, that means that both of the organisms are benefiting. And one example we talked about with mutualism is between flowers and bees. Because in this example, both organisms are benefiting from this relationship. The flowers are getting their genetic information spread, and the bees are getting to eat that flower, the nectar and the pollen, okay? So both of these organisms are benefiting from that relationship. We also have another type of symbiosis that's not so beneficial, something called parasitism. Oh, what am I doing? Let's see, parasitism. All right, and with parasitism, you might recognize the word parasite. If something is a parasite, it is essentially taking advantage of another organism. So in parasitism, one organism is benefiting and the other organism is harmed. So we talked about one example of parasitism. This is something like humans and mosquitoes. In this relationship, mosquitoes are benefiting, right? They're getting to suck our blood and just have a nice little feast. But humans aren't really benefiting from this relationship. In fact, we're often harmed, right? Because we get those nasty bug bites, and then sometimes those mosquitoes can spread diseases to us. So that is an example of parasitism, where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. And the final type of symbiosis is something called commensalism. All right, and in commensalism, it's kind of the best of both worlds, okay? One organism is benefiting from the relationship, and the other organism isn't really affected. So they're neither harmed, they're not harmed, they're not benefited, they're just indifferent towards the situation. So an example of commensalism, well, let me write this down, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, so with commensalism, one organism benefits and the other organism is neither harmed nor benefited. So one example of this that we mentioned is, for example, humans and dust mites, specifically dust mites that live in your eyebrows, okay? Some of you might not have even known that we have dust mites on our body, okay? Because this is an example of commensalism, where those dust mites are benefited. They get to walk around our skin and our eyebrows and eat our dead skin cells, and they get fed, but we're not harmed or benefited. In fact, we don't even realize they're there. So that's an example of commensalism, because the dust mites are benefited, and humans, we don't really care. we're indifferent towards the situation. So those are the three types of symbiosis. We've got mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. If you are unclear about any of those definitions, please write down your question and let your teacher know so that they can help you out. Oh, right. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is something called keystone species. And I'll give you a quick definition before we get too deep into this. Keystone species are basically, they define ecosystems. So keystone species are a defining factor of ecosystems. And they're so important to that ecosystem that without them, the ecosystem would kind of be screwed. So they're so important that without them, the ecosystem would look completely different, or sometimes would even cease to exist. So they are really like the front and centerpiece of this ecosystem. They are super, super important in keeping that ecosystem healthy and alive. So I'm actually going to show you guys a video about keystone species before we read through these passages. Now, warning, this video might get removed by YouTube for copyright. So if it does, I'll link this video when I post the assignment, but we're just going to keep our fingers crossed and hope that YouTube doesn't catch us. I probably shouldn't say that on the record, but oh well. All right, so here is an example of keystone species, specifically how wolves change rivers. So in this example, wolves are the keystone species, and we're going to see how they impacted this ecosystem.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behaviour of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilised the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was a soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
All right, so fingers crossed that YouTube doesn't assassinate me. But that video is a perfect example of how wolves are a keystone species, right? Because before the wolves were reintroduced to this national park, the park wasn't exactly thriving. We saw deer were doing great, but all of the grass was completely gone, and a lot of those natural species had gone elsewhere. But as soon as the wolves were reintroduced, yes, we saw a decrease in deer, rest in peace to them, but we saw a huge increase in the amount of other species and other genetic diversity that was entering the area. So this is just an example of how, I mean, it's the circle of life, right? All organisms have to work together in order to create this beautiful ecosystem and this beautiful earth that we all enjoy. So with that in mind, we're going to read two examples or two passages about keystone species. So as you go through, as always, please annotate this passage so that we can answer those two questions below. All right, so a keystone species is one whose presence contributes to the diversity of life and whose extinction would lead to the extinction of other forms of life. A keystone species helps to support the ecosystem of which it is a part. So I'm going to highlight these two sentences. So a keystone species contributes to the diversity of life and whose extinction would lead to the extinction of other forms of life. When we say that, we mean that if the keystone species is gone, a lot of other forms of life are going to die as well. All right, and that keystone species helps to support the ecosystem of which it's a part, right? So we saw that those wolves, when they were reintroduced, we saw the area that they were in just skyrocket in terms of life. More animals re-entered the area, the trees grew taller. So really those keystone species are just crucial and essential in terms of the ecosystem that they're living in. So an example of what can happen when a keystone species is removed occurred when fur hunters eliminated sea otters from some Pacific Ocean kelp beds. Otters eat sea urchins, which eat kelp. With its major predator gone, sea urchin populations exploded and consumed most of the kelp. Fish, snails, and other animals associated with the kelp beds disappeared. So this is one example of how humans kind of screw up the environment, right? So when these fur hunters killed off the sea otters to get presumably the fur, what ended up happening? Well, we see that fish, snails, and other animals associated with those kelp beds all died too. So this is just one example of how this sea otter, which is a keystone species, when it disappeared, all of these other life forms disappeared as well. Let's keep reading. The grizzly bear is another example of a keystone species. Grizzlies transfer nutrients from the ocean ecosystem to the forest ecosystem. The first stage of this transfer is performed by salmon that swim up rivers, sometimes for hundreds of miles. Salmon are rich in nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and phosphorus. The bears capture the salmon and then carry them onto dry land, scattering nutrient-rich feces or wastes and partially eaten carcasses. It has been estimated that the bears leave up to half of the salmon they harvest on the forest floor. All right, so in this example, we see that the grizzly bear is taking nutrients from the ocean ecosystem and transferring those nutrients to the forest ecosystem. All right, let's go over these questions. So number 1 says, some people feel that the grizzly bear should be eliminated from parts of its natural range. Describe the impact of this proposed action on the forest ecosystems in these areas if the bears are eliminated, and support your answer with information from the passage. All right, so we just learned from this passage that grizzly bears take these important nutrients from the salmon in the ocean ecosystem, and they transfer those nutrients to the forest ecosystem. So when they dump the salmon onto the ground, the nitrogen, the sulfur, the carbon, and the phosphorus that are found in the salmon are transferred over to that forest ecosystem and are used to enrich the soil and other plants and animals. So if we were to eliminate the grizzly bear from this ecosystem, what would happen? Since the grizzly bear is a keystone species, let's see if I can type and write. I'm not very good at multitasking. All right, so because the grizzly bear is a keystone species, the ecosystem, let's say the forest ecosystem, depends on its presence. Without the grizzly bear, the plants and animals that depend on the nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and phosphorus found in the salmon carcasses would not be able to survive. So this would impact the forest ecosystem because it would completely change, because let's specify the forest dwelling. Plants and animals that depend on those nutrients wouldn't be able to survive because they don't get those nutrients without the help of the grizzly bear. Okay, so let's make sure that makes sense. Because the grizzly bear is a keystone species, the forest ecosystem depends on its presence. Without the grizzly bear, the forest-dwelling plants and animals that depend on the nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and phosphorus found in the salmon carcasses would not be able to survive. Perfect. So make sure that in your answer you use evidence found in the passage. But we're just trying to explain that without those grizzly bears, that forest ecosystem would not survive, and we would see a lot of death on that forest. All right, let's keep going. Number 2, the United States government does not allow travelers from foreign countries to bring plants, fruits, vegetables, animals, or other living organisms into this country. State one biological reason for keeping these out of the United States. So there are a lot of different answers for this. I'm going to go over 3 possible answers that you might have. The first one being I've lost my brain. Those new organisms, or those organisms being introduced, could carry new parasites or diseases that would be introduced into the US. And obviously this would be harmful to our plants and animals living, or even people living here in the United States. So those organisms might carry some sort of parasite and bring that into the United States. Another possible answer is that these new organisms being introduced would compete for resources with our native species. So they could be competing over food or for land. So we would introduce competition into the United States, which could have some pretty detrimental effects. And finally, the organisms being introduced wouldn't have any natural predators within the United States. So the organisms being introduced would not have any natural predators in the US, And because they don't have any natural predators, they would just continue to grow and grow and grow without anything keeping them in check. And I've actually got an example for you about that. So let me write that down. They would not have any natural predators and would continue to grow, growing out of control. That's not really a sentence, but we're going to go with it. So this is something that we call invasive species. You might have heard that term before, but we call invasive species any sort of species that is introduced into an environment where it doesn't have any natural predators. And because of that, it continues to grow and grow and grow, which wreaks havoc on everything around it. And most of you guys know I grew up in the South, and in the South, there's a huge problem with a plant called kudzu. So kudzu is an example of invasive species. Kudzu, I believe, is natively found in Japan. And like 150 years ago, it was brought over to the South. Some stupid person brought it over thinking it would be a beautiful plant for their garden, and quickly realized that it was not a beautiful plant for their garden because it was an invasive species. And because there are no natural predators in the United States, it just continued to grow and grow and grow and literally took over entire ecosystems. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like. This plant, it just keeps growing and growing, and it grows over everything. So you can look at these pictures. This is just one example of an invasive species. If this organism is not kept in check by its environment, meaning there aren't any predators to keep its population stable, it will just continue to grow and grow and grow. So this is one other danger of bringing foreign species to the United States, because there aren't any natural predators, and you can have something like this happen. Whew, I got PTSD from this kudzu, man. It just grows over everything. All right, so that is an example of an invasive species. Once again, if you have any questions, please write them down, let us know. We've got one more passage to read, and then we've got some questions to go over, and then we're done. All right, part B is labeled "There is no place like home." Some pets need expensive food, or grow to large sizes, or have nasty, dangerous behavior. Because of this, some people realize that they can no longer care for their pets. A pet twist-necked turtle in a state of near starvation was found by rescuers at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. The food that this species eats is not commonly found in New York State. In Florida and other warm states, people have released pet snakes such as pythons and anacondas into local lakes and swamps, and even to humans. Those released pets that survive in their new environment can eventually breed and multiply, causing even more problems. And the question that we need to answer is identify one abiotic factor that might affect the survival of a released pet, and explain why that factor would affect survival. Remember that abiotic is non-living. So we need to identify one non-living factor that would affect the survival of this plant. I've got two examples for you. One being water. So if there's not enough water in the environment, that animal could become dehydrated, right? And if that animal becomes dehydrated, that could affect survival. So if there's not enough, animal would become dehydrated and potentially die. Okay, so water is one non-living factor. Another one could be the climate or the weather. So let's say climate. Obviously, different animals are adapted to different types of climates, and if the climate that animal prefers is not present, then that animal is going to have a tough time surviving. So the climate is going to impact survival as well. So let's see how I can phrase this. Different animals are adapted to different climates. If an animal is forced to live in a different climate, they may have trouble surviving. All right, so those are two examples of abiotic factors that would affect survival. You may have thought of a different one. That totally works. Just make sure it is a non-living factor that could affect the survival. All right, and finally, the last thing we're going to do today is we've got a few different practice questions to go over together. The first one says the map below shows the movement of some air pollution across parts of the United States. So we see that the prevailing winds are blowing northeast, which means that all of the pollution found in these states over here are really all blowing towards Maryland, towards Baltimore. Okay, so using that information, let's answer this question. Which statement is a correct inference that can be drawn from this information? A, Illinois produces more air pollution than the other states shown. So Illinois is right here. I don't see any indication that it's producing more pollution, but we'll keep going and see if we need to come back to that. B, the air pollution problem in Baltimore is increased by the addition of pollution from other areas. All right, so we do see that all of these areas' pollution is blowing towards Baltimore. So that could be a correct answer, but let's keep going and see if there's any other answers. C, there are no air pollution problems in southern states. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. So we don't see any arrows showing the pollution found in these other states, but that may just be because these states aren't, what is the word I'm trying to find, aren't the focus of this diagram. So we'll come back to that as well. And D, the air pollution problems in Virginia clear up quickly as the air moves towards the sea. I don't see any indication of that on this graph. So I believe that the answer here is going to be B. The air pollution problem in Baltimore is increased by the addition of pollution from other areas, because we see that the wind is blowing all of this pollution towards the Baltimore area. So that would be confirmed by this graph, because we see that Baltimore's pollution problem is influenced by all of these other states and the wind that's blowing it towards Maryland. So the correct answer here is going to be, let me insert a little smiley face, is going to be B. All right. Number 2, species of finches are represented in the diagram below. This is a graph that you will see on the Regents a lot. It basically shows different finch species, and it shows the types of beaks they have as well as what food they eat. So with this question, they want us to state the name of one species of finch from the diagram that is most likely to compete with the small tree finch if they lived on the same island. And we need to support our answer with an explanation. Well, I know that this graph is impossible to read, so I pulled up a bigger picture of it that we're going to use to answer this. So we are asked about the small tree finch. We're told to see what other finch species is going to compete with that small tree finch on the same island. So looking at this graph, these two circles right here, these two outer circles, or the ones in the middle rather, are talking about the beak that that finch has. So the small tree finch is going to have a biting tip and a grasping bill. That's talking about the beak that it possesses. But this very inner circle is talking about the food that they eat with those beaks. So our small tree finch eats mainly animal food, so things like bugs and worms. And we know that competition ensues when different species are trying to eat the same food. So I would venture to say that we're looking at these two species right here to figure out which one competes with our small tree finch, because all three of these species right here eat mainly animal food. And I'm going to say that our large tree finch is going to compete with our small tree finch because they have the same type of beak and they eat the same food. So they're going to be going after the same prey while trying to eat. And obviously that is going to increase competition. Okay, so once again, you're looking at the type of beak that they have as well as the food that they eat. So in this example, the large tree finch is going to compete with the small because they're going after the same type of food. Okay, so let me insert the text box. Okay, so the large tree finch will compete with the small tree finch because they have the same type of beak and eat the same type of food. Okay, if present on the same island, they will, let's say, competition will ensue as they fight over the same food. All right, 2 more questions. Number 3, base your answer to the following question on the information below and on your knowledge of biology. Gars, which are large ox-like animals found in South Asia, have been hunted for sport for many generations. Most recently, as human populations have increased, the gars' habitats of forests, bamboo jungles, and grasslands have dwindled, which means they got smaller. The gar is now considered an endangered species. Scientists have succeeded in preserving endangered species by cloning. Recently, a gar was cloned, and the resulting embryo was placed inside a domestic cow, which then gave birth to a baby gar. State one biological benefit of preserving endangered species. So there are many benefits to preserving endangered species, but I would say probably the biggest one is preserving that genetic information and that genetic diversity, because we know that the more biological diversity or the more genetic diversity that's present in an area, the better off we all are. We know that the increase in genetic diversity really leads to an increase in survival. So let's say that one benefit of preserving endangered species, oh my God, I can't spell, endangered species is preserving their genetic diversity and genetic material. So if you thought of a different answer for this, that's totally fine, but I would say the one that I thought we should focus on is just the prevalence of that genetic diversity and the genetic material that we want to hold on to, because if that species dies, that diversity is gone forever. So we want to really hold on to those endangered species so that we can continue to have this big, beautiful Earth, guys. Oh, all right. And finally, our last question is, what is the role of bacteria and fungi in an ecosystem? So I hope you all know this by now, but we know that bacteria and fungi are decomposers. Okay, so bacteria and fungi are decomposers. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they decompose or break down dead matter in an ecosystem. And most importantly, recycle those nutrients. Oh, my text box isn't big enough. All right, and they recycle those nutrients back into the environment. Okay, so they break down dead organisms and then they recycle those important nutrients back into the environment to be used by plants and just continue that big old circle. Okay. All right, that is all I have for you today. If you think of any questions you have about this, please let me know. All of this is fair game for your test on Monday. Okay, so make sure that you are keeping up with your schoolwork and asking any questions before Monday so that we can help you out before your test. Okay, I hope you guys have a wonderful day and I will see you later. How do I stop this? I always struggle. My God.